for SK to pick it up here. Trying to walk through the smoke, but it's just not going to happen. SK Gaming, second major championship in a row. They are your winners.
Despite Fnatic's best efforts, it goes the distance. It goes all three maps, and we have our champions, the best team in the world, Ninjas in Pajamas.
Red touching the box, are they going to peek? Holding it now, and there is it. It's just out of Flamey. It's not going to happen. Astralis have won the face at London main. There's no time. He just has to watch that clock tick down. This is it. Na'Vi have taken the major.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Time Travel LAN, the content everyone loves but no one watches. What we do is, it's literally ridiculous. I'm just watching the views get less. Like the grand final, no one's going to watch it. Jokes write themselves. Duncan's already got one percolating, but I'm not going to let him say it. Anyway, yes, what is Time Travel LAN? If you are tuning in for like this, which will be the 6th episode, which is like weird to just start there. Basically, we crafted a theoretical CSGO tournament of all of the best teams ever to have played, and we pitch them against each other, and then we discuss who we think would win and why. Joining me, of course, you've got Moses, Sponge, and Thorin. Between them all, the requisite levels of knowledge from gameplay, from history, from regions, and me kind of offering my opinions because I was often lurking in the back. Sounds horrible when you put it like that. Lurking in the back room, lurking as a journalist. And, you
just
know,
watching it all, I guess.
Yeah,
take it all in.
Yeah, like Littlefinger. Brilliant. Good times. Definitely didn't waste my life. So anyway, let's start with this one. This one's actually a bit of a doozy. 2016 Luminosity, that is the classic Brazilian lineup that went on to join SK Gaming, sort of still at the peak of their powers in many ways. There's a lot of controversy around that move at the time. We'll no doubt talk about that. And of course, 2015 EnVyUs, and by that I mean the former LDLC lineup, but obviously when they dropped Shocks and Smith and added Kenny S and Apex into that roster. So mid-2015 onwards. So let's start. I don't know which team do you want to talk about first?
Well, the good news is, because this is time travel, LAN, and we're talking about this team when they're at the peak, these guys can sort of metaphorically time travel back to a period when they had integrity. You can just talk about what they really think about these players, because this is when they're really good. Should we start like that, shall we, guys? On sort of a shitty passive-aggressive tone. Welcome, it's going to be a different vibe this time. Yeah, I'll get going eventually, don't worry, Tony. You're okay.
Yeah, no, I mean, at the time, the 2016 Luminosity team, I think, I think it's actually a super interesting team to talk about overall, like in a historical perspective. But I mean, just starting with the team at the time as well, like they had just made those changes, kicking out Bolts, and I forget who the other player was. They actually dropped it. Yep. And they brought in Taco, FNX, and obviously Zeus is the coach, so they were kind of hitting a stride. They had that incredible first tournament. I think that was like the DreamHack event. That was also like the Face It stage something finals. It was like their grand finals. They got like 60-0, run all the way to the end, to the grand finals, lost there. Had that Katowice run to the grand finals as well, lost to Fnatic in heartbreaking fashion, and then come into the major, able to win the major. But at the time, I think like the key characteristics of the team, on individual levels, you had coldzera, who was like, I don't know, he's just one of the best players in the world. His kind of step up from like out of nowhere to being in professional counterstrike. I think he didn't go like an event without a negative rating for like 2 years or something mental to start his career. One of the highest rated players at the major still to this day as well. So he was a huge factor. Fallen's opping was pretty incredible. Like, I mean, I think you could make arguments for who is the best opper with Guardian and Kenny S still around and thriving in the scene, but certainly one of like the top 3, top 5 oppers and players in the world that year. And I think obviously one of the big things, the topic of conversation was just the way they actually constructed the team. This was like a meta-defining shift in how the game was played. Like this was one of the kind of the first teams to have like that hardcore supportive player of Taco paired up with their star player of coldzera. They had movements across the map and abilities to have different plans and route towards other bomb sites if things went wrong. So I think they were just like hitting a really good stride both individually with a couple of players. Fur, obviously, was playing really well at the time also. And then also just kind of like a game plan that actually just kind of worked, and it felt like that team had like a really, really good flow to it to be able to get out of tough situations.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of when the team was put together, the thing that sort of blew my mind about it all was, you know, people reacted very negatively to those cuts. Like when Bolts and Steel was taken out, people, and you bring in an unknown like Cold Zero, people were like really resistant to it. They were like, oh, you know, it's a backward step. It's like a fallen ego thing because he thinks he's discovered someone. It was kind of weird at the time, like how much flack they got, and yet they really did hit the ground running. Like, you know, with that lineup, it wasn't a particularly long period of time before you started seeing real tangible returns on the server. The thing that interests me in this lineup, Duncan, is there'll be a lot of people who obviously won't know FNX from 1.6 or even Fallen for that matter. I think because Fallen was kind of very, you know, he competed at Source tournaments as well, famously with like target down, and he got a lot of shit because he was quoted as saying Source is a much more tactical game, which the 1.6 fans definitely didn't like. But obviously FNX was considered like, you know, one of the sort of like really, you know, cultured players from that region and was very highly regarded even before his CSGO career.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is both those players, because they are like, in Fallen's case, he had a massive CSGO career. FNX had like a little bit of a CSGO career. Bizarrely, obviously, he actually is back right now as we film this, even though he's sort of a relic of the past to some degree. The thing is, though, the key thing to understand is this: they are the opposite players in 1.6. In 1.6, it's actually FNX who is like the second star of a team, who's like his contributions like put you over the top to win the game, and he's a mad talented player. I would say in CSGO, he was much more of like the classic role player who's using your smarts and experience to win. Meanwhile, Fallen, a lot of people won't know this, he wasn't an end-game leader in 1.6 as far as I know. Maybe at the very, very end, he might have done it. I don't think even then he did. As far as I know, actually, I think he switched when he did the Source move you're talking about, which is one of the reasons I actually never personally sort of took it as like the greatest heresy ever that he said Source was a more technical game. Like, he was the bloody Orper in 1.6. That's the idiot just stood there going, is he in the back crosshair? No, don't fire. Like, that's the flowchart for an Orper, boys. Like, if people don't know, what Fallen was trying to do in 1.6 was like all the Brazilians, they all wanted to be Kogu, everyone wanted to be the superstar Orper who could be like internationally recognized. Now, Fallen only had like realistically like a year or so at the end, like a year and a half that he could even be in position to do that, and his teams weren't quite as good as Kogu's were. So he was more, I would say, like just like an up and coming talented Orper at the time and at the end of 1.6. So the cool thing for me in CSGO is how they did the transformation. Like I say, FNX did almost like, reminds me of almost what people like Neo and Taz did, where they actually just shift their game totally in the different version of the game they're not as good at, to just use all the strengths of having experience and knowing how to win scenarios and not shit your pants when you're on stage. Meanwhile, the interesting thing with Fallen, I think it ties to the whole team, is, right, it's funny because when I actually went back, and I went back myself and checked out that video that everyone was trying to meme on me, where I said he was the best in-game leader in 2016, which is the prime era of this team. And part of the thing is, though, if you go back, though, that's what I think makes this team really interesting. And it's like more of a discussion I want to bring these guys in on, was I actually do think this was a team where their rise to the top charts perfectly with the change in how Counter-Strike was played. Because if you look at past years, funnily enough, one of the teams we'll compare them to, the Envy teams, the Fnatic teams, even TSM, the Danes, what you did at the time there was you stack as many skilled players as you can together. And this was almost the birth of like FPL thinking of like, right, you let the stars kind of figure out how they want to play, and then they do a little bit what they want in the mid round. And you don't, it's not just like a tactic from spawn, which is the old thinking in Counter-Strike. And it's not like modern day thinking now, it's more like, I guess, adaptive to what you do in round to round and more mid round calls. I would say it's where like players got to have a little bit more agency. So I always thought was epic about this team and what Fallen did with his squad was, you saw before he brought in Cold Zero that actually the team was way better than they had any right being in the server with the players they used to have. Like, they used to be mega when they were in a 5v4 scenario, even when they were against like top teams. It's why they could have all those crazy BO1 flukes and make top 8 at the major just every single time, no matter who they were in the group with. Like, that is insane. So to me, there was already something there. Like, they'd sort of cracked something about CSGO. And then to me, you just add in the talent. Like, let's be real, Cold Zero, probably the most like consistently high performing player we'd seen at that point in time in CSGO. Like, every tournament he gives you, it's the dream if you're in IGL. He gives you like the exact same numbers, the exact same scenarios he wins. He plays the exact same way. What a guy to build your team around. So to me, as much as like now, maybe knowing some of the things we know, people might take a little bit of the IGL aspect away from Fallen and say like, maybe the players had more input, or Cold Zero himself clearly made a lot of calls around what he wanted to do. I actually think at the time, the style that they played, it really did counter a lot of what the others were doing. Because if you think of like a Fnatic style era before, that's all like genius players in the mid round just make a call off like a basic setup of like, run this part of the map. So Flusher does a push back here that opens up the defense, or Olofmeister just breaks a site open. This was the era when the reason they ran the clock down every single time is they're just trying to play off like team play concepts, like knowing your dynamic of how you play this part of the map. Like I actually thought the way they sort of played the other teams, not the map, is what makes this team genius. And why I actually, even though accomplishment wise, I don't think it can possibly be number one. I think it's actually like an underrated, like in terms of what they could do in the server, I think this team was mega. Because one of the things I was always impressed by was that aspect was like they were basically able to play every single map, if you remember, in the map pool minus their permaban. Like I don't think they were actually like Prime Astralis and they were just good on all those maps. I think that what that means is you just mastered your style of play and you're playing the opponent, you're not playing the map. So I always thought it showed that actually like this is one of those teams where I always thought it was really hard to beat even if they didn't win.
They adjusted, like when you're talking about like meta defining or shifting team, I think something that goes like under discussed. It was late 2015 when the update came in to make the bomb timer 40 seconds from 35
Yes.
and the round time 155 from 145, because we would just keep bottom banana smoked for like the whole game of Inferno, right? And there wasn't enough time on the clock. So Valve made a little bit longer. And then in matchmaking, it was 45 seconds for the bomb timer. And in official games, it was 35. So we met in the middle, like Valve made it 40 seconds, which ended up giving the ability to go a bit slower in retakes, right? Because you didn't have to rush situation. And that's one of the things that Fallen's crew was really good at, was the late retakes, being patient, and they would let the pressure build on their opponent as the bomb's ticking down. And for whatever reason, time after time, and this is where Fallen and Combat Orping came into play, because he would wait so late in these retakes that they would have to take these close duels and would get close and flicky in sights, and he was doing all that. But I think like when you look at this team as a whole, this is maybe when the role conversation we had kind of just went from, oh, this guy's the AWPer and this guy's the entry fragger, to we started talking more about like supportive players and anchors, right? Because Taco is the perfect right-hand man to coldzera. That relationship, Taco would do everything to keep coldzera alive and set him up for those. And coldzera would deliver, right? Like you were putting there, Duncan, coldzera would deliver off that. You had FNX, who was an elder statesman and experienced player. You watch him play, he never looks stressed. Right, he will always be good when he needs to get you that two-man spray down as they're coming out B plateau on fucking Cobble. He'll get you that kill. And then you obviously had Fur, who could do whatever the fuck he wanted. They just let Fur go aggressive, and with the information Fur would get, it wasn't like art. He wouldn't just run in. Like he would do like those overpass timings and shit. With that information, they would be able to win the rounds and have good mid-round setups, and Fallen would just rotate around with the AWP. So when you think about the way that's played, that's pretty close to how it's played today, right? Like there's a couple of adjustments and we're better with utility. That's thanks to Astralis. But you go back and you watch the team who these guys are playing. We're obviously going to talk about them later. But EnVyUs, Counter-Strike back then was so much more crude. It was just like in your face, take some spawn timings. You're calling more from spawn, and then the mid-round reactions are trying to find a gap. I think with this crew that we're talking about, they started to really iron out and develop how we can approach the game in similar ways to what we're doing today. So yeah, I can kind of see that sentiment.
I actually have a couple of things I can build off some of those points. I know Chad brought up like this being like the first team we really had like the in-depth discussion about roles. And I remember at the time, like in this era of CS, I was very vocal about, I hated like the designation of someone as like a support player, because I just thought it didn't have any like clear definition. And I think it was just a nice, convenient way for people to excuse, bad performances. Yeah. And I mean, there was an era obviously where support players were more of a thing, but I think as time got on, it just kind of, I think it was just more and more of a live ability. And I think the silliness is giving someone that support designation. But I remember having this conversation at one of the Cologne events. It might have been 2016, it might have been 2017, talking with coldzera and Taco specifically about it, because I'm like, I wanted their opinion on like the idea of like a support player, since Taco's always the one like kind of put into that hole. And coldzera just like cut me off and was just like, look, like when Taco and I are playing together, I'm the support player. Cold's like, he's also like the star player to the public, but he's like, I'm the one being the support player in this situation, because I'm actually supporting Taco so that he can get an entry kill or gain possession of a part of the map. Like when they work in tandem, I'm full support for Taco until he makes his play, and then things kind of switch as once we get that map control, then Taco is able to use his stuff to support me and then like make sure that I'm in a position to win the round at the end of the day. So I always thought that was like a fun conversation between those two, but just like that fluid nature of support between the two of them working in tandem was pretty cool. And then also when Duncan gave his point about either the IGL style of Fallen, just giving, like, this was kind of an era where I think the words you used, like, you were giving agency to the other individual players. Just from being with Fallen and Liquid when we brought him in for those few months before I left, just his calling style is essentially he controls like the big picture stuff. He'll be like, okay, we're going to take long here, and then he's like, all right, now's the time in the round, guys, start taking catwalk. And then from that point, he doesn't care. He doesn't like want to know. He doesn't care to know how you're taking catwalk. That's all up to the two players, you know, taking that position on the map. He's very much just like, give me control of this part of the map. This is the part of the map that I want to have control of at this point in the round, and I don't care how you do it. So it very much was like giving the freedom. So like, yeah, hey, Taco and Coldzera, go take catwalk, and those two have their own like different plans and routines of what they go through depending on if they feel like there's presence on catwalk or if it's a passive setup or wherever it might be at the time. So I think that's spot on. I mean, Fallen very much wants his individuals to like solve the problems themselves, but he's the one saying, this is a problem that we need to solve. We need catwalk. Go get it for me. And the player's going to dictate a lot of how that's done.
One thing I'd say, by the way, just a brief point about this team as well, is I think this is also a team that, like, even though they, as we're probably going to discuss, they didn't actually get as many trophies as people probably imagine, because they had obviously the two majors with a big deal. But I actually think, low-key, this is also like a really clutch team, like a very good team if you're in like a 14-14 game or it's going down to the wire. Like, this team was amazing at just coming through those games. Like I say, just super hard to beat.
Oh yeah, that was one of the things about them. Like it was the first time I'd really thought a lot about intangibles in Counter-Strike, I guess, because it's like the problem you've always got is, you know, in other sports when someone is like a clutch player, when someone is a winner, you can sort of articulate it, but you couldn't really explain why, for example, you know, certain players go missing in the playoffs, other players step up and do their best work when it matters. And realistically, we didn't sort of have a lot of teams where, you know, there was kind of a need to talk about that kind of stuff, because we went from like, you know, NIP, and then you start segueing into like the Fnatic era, you know, via way of maybe the French guys. And there was always just one team that was dominant and never really got tested all that much. Yeah, there was like a couple of great series, a couple of great rivalries, but by and large, the team that was on top dominated the scene, dominated the tournaments, and did so for the best part of a year before there was like some sort of seismic shift. But with this team, with Luminosity, what really struck out to me was there was some games where they should have been dead and buried, like 100% should have been out of it. And yet they were able to pull out, like, routinely, as a matter of fact, like an amazing individual play. They'd have an amazing read. They would just get something in a game that would just shift the momentum in their favor. And no doubt we'll talk about Columbus as being an example of that. But, you know, you could pick a ton of games, I reckon, where they were like, you know, like you say, 14, you know, the opposite team's got 14 rounds and they were somehow able to come back and win. Really felt like they were never out of any series they played in.
I mean, even just like that's actually, I think, funnily enough, this is one of the reasons I actually think he's slightly overrated as a player. I actually think what people don't get about Fallen is his whole career was like the YouTube highlight video. Like, all the big moments are in the biggest matches ever. So, like, not only did this team themselves get all the crazy moments, the fucking Coldzera jumping up moment, like, they had a billion of these crazy moments that came for them. But in terms of Fallen, like Moses was describing about, Chad was talking about the combat AWPing. Like, every time you're in 1v2 against Fallen, you always think, like, right, as long as, like, the first guy doesn't just die pointlessly or doesn't just like give up, and he would always be the first kill that you couldn't afford to give away, and then suddenly you would actually feel like this is a factor I think is rare compared to a lot of players. He actually, in the clutch like that, had the feeling like you get when you watch Simple play in his prime, where it's like you actually are sure he's going to get the next kill. Doesn't matter how unlikely it looks on your screen. It's like, it feels like a movie, you know. Like, one of the reasons why Hollywood movies aren't engaging is that you never feel like the protagonist's in danger. Of course he's going to win this fist fight, he's the protagonist, right? You had that feeling when these guys was in these clutches, and the same with Coldzera as well. He was another amazing clutch player. So, like, if you have two players like that, I even think Taco was like mildly underrated as like a big game player. Like, as much as everyone, especially when he came in the lineup, was like, the guy shit because the stats were terrible. Like, not only did you start to see over the years the massive impact he's having on Coldzera's game, I don't think Coldzera was ever the same without him, by the way, if you look at the time when they split apart. And then secondly, I think the whole angle of, like, considering he did actually start a bit ropey and had no experience, he actually was always the guy where it's like, on paper, if I was like the FaZe Clan team that used to lose to their next version, that'd be the player where I'd be like, what are we doing wrong that we have like all the best players and they have Tackle and they win every time? Because he just would somehow like slightly overperform in all these big games. Like, he never would be the massive weak point that you thought. He very rarely ever was, actually, if people don't remember back. It's only maybe at the beginning, the odd touch and go tournament. I thought he was generally a very consistent player.
Loads of people were calling for him to get ousted.
Understandably, yeah.
Yeah, and that was a weird.
You know?
Yeah, well, true. I mean,
Didn't work out very well.
Yeah, that was just a weird period, wasn't it? Like towards the end. I mean, like I always thought Taco was like an underrated player as well, but certainly
Team Liquid shows that, mate. Look what he did without him.
Yeah. That was
exactly.
a good run. I think something that was key to this team was like some of the maps they were really strong at, like Train, for example. Because like this is back in the time when I was in Renegades and we were in North America, right? So we played these guys a couple of times. And I think one of the times we played them, it was at the E-League on Train, and they fucking 16-0'd us. We got smashed.
16-0, yeah.
Yeah, we got absolutely reamed out. But like I looked at their Train, and in that year they played it. They won 46 times, lost 5. And they had 19 Train wins in a row. Like that's
And remember, this is the era when they're not like, it's not getting banned against them. They're just playing the other great Train teams. They're playing fucking VP and Navi, like all the best teams on those maps, just winning every time. It was mega, wasn't it?
That setup was crazy, right? Because Taco like defined the way to play. Like him and like Zip, I guess, were the two players who defined the way to play. Like inside anchor, just jiggle at the low round with the molly in hand, and then you delay for your rotator. They had the way that Cold Zero would play Ivy. Like he was the only player in the world to be able to play that consistently, and he would always play passive, like back alley side. And I think it's because they had FNX and Fur who would go up close behind Fallen's AWP, get close pop or close main, and then they were able to do that setup, rinse and repeat. And Fallen men had all the room for Fallen to rotate around with that AWP, and they could even second AWP with Cold over Ivy. I remember that, like they basically defined the way the map was being played at the time, and they were just like, you couldn't stop them coming out mid. Like they would just come out mid on T-side and just fuck you. Like there's nothing you could do. I think so. Train was an important map back then. I think Cobble was another map that was important. Like I think Cold Zero played drop, and he was just like, you couldn't get past him. Like if you can't even get a little bit of drop room, you can't like apply pressure on the B site properly. And obviously Mirage was one of their staples. So like their map pool, like they were good at most maps. Right? I think it was just like Cage and Nuke they weren't great on. And that's before. This is before people played Nuke the way that people play Nuke now, because it went through all those changes, right? Remember, it had the outside railing and shit. Like we don't have Nuke the same way it is played today. And yeah, it's these guys had really strong setups with the double AWP availability of Fallen and Cold Zero. They had the aggressive rifling of Fur. Like he was always getting away with the crazy pushes. Like if people remember, there's like a couple of names, right, you can throw into that. I guess modern day, you're thinking about like Arts and Nafanies and that kind of shit. But JW used to do it with the AWP. Fur was like the first guy kind of doing it consistently with the rifle, always pushing and being a nuisance. So they were just such a, like, they were a really well-rounded team, I think.
Oh, and by the way, because obviously now it became a meme, this era of the team was really good on the old fucking version of Inferno. Before we got like the rework, they were mega on that one. They won loads of the big games on that one. I know later on it became a meme that Fallen teams can't do Inferno. That was different lineups years later, though. This team was legit as fuck on that map.
Well, let's talk about just overall the kind of like plethora of talent on the lineup as well, because I mean, you know, in terms of where it started, what you would have expected to what it delivered in 2016, it's actually staggering. You know, you had Cold Zero as the #1 player of the year, which, you know, by the way, remember he came from a literal sort of, you know, relatively unknown Brazilian team. Fallen just had a good feeling about him. Fallen was second that year. 15th was Fur, and FNX was 19th as well out of the top 20 players in HLTV. So, you know, there hasn't been many teams in history that sort of have had, you know, the 1 and the 2 players on the same lineup. And listen, I don't know if we all agree. I think in that year, 2016, I think Fallen was probably good value for that. You could have maybe had an argument about Device that year as well, but that was obviously before they got turbocharged and kind of became Astralis with Glaive. So,
yeah, I think someone disagree. I'll disagree.
Okay, yeah, no, by
I'll
all
do
means.
a quick version. I'll do a separate video on this topic. Don't worry. Basically, the short version goes like this. Not at all, and here's why. Because if you go and look at the best AWPers in the world, Guardian, Kenny S, maybe still. I mean, that's a bit more debatable, but you're still around. Like, obviously, these players are all still here in the game. The difference is this. Like, they are what you would imagine the primary AWP star is. Like, every single round, the AWP goes to him. You always save the AWP. If it's the 4th round of the game, you're always going with him, and he has to carry the game, right? If there was no Cold Zero on this team, like, I don't think Fallen would even crack top 10 on this list. He wouldn't even be in position to ever crack top 10. Like, if you go look up his numbers are woeful for someone who's supposed to be a superstar AWPer. And that's Chad this. Chad's obviously agrees with some of the things on HLTV. Go and look for 2016 at Fallen stats and tell me how good you think they are. This is just based on how the stats normally go. Like, I don't think people realize like they're really not monster numbers. Like, he's not breaking the fucking meter. The number of kills per round is mad woeful for an AWP, by the way.
Is this the type of consideration though? Just playing devil's advocate because I'm trying to bring him up. But is this like where the consideration comes into the in-game leading as well as the output? Do you think? Like, I'm not.
As far as I know, the HLTV top 20 is unrelated to in-game leading.
Okay. Yeah, it's
like, for example, like you can never get on there if you're existence, MSL. You'll never get on there no matter what you do, mate. I think it's just as a player, right?
Yeah, it's all statistical.
Yes,
is my understanding.
So that's my problem, Chad. Here's the thing: if we're somehow shading in being an IGL, I could be with you. I'd say maybe he's top 5 then. But I think the idea he is the second best player in 2016 is absurd. The stats don't bear it out. Like I say, the eye test does in the sense that he has the big moments. They don't. If you look, here's the problem with Fallen, right? If you watch a YouTube highlight video, he's the best AWP ever. Take an actual POV demo of a game, and you'll be very underwhelmed. What you'll find is he doesn't have to do stuff to win half these games, mate. The keys he does get are massively impactful. They put you over the top. But essentially, unlike Kenny S, that's why I drew the analogy. Kenny S and Guardian have to do most of the heavy lifting and win you the fucking game. I don't think Fallen ever had to do that. So my problem is this. Look, I gave it up to coldzera because coldzera did it in every format of Counter-Strike. He did it in the normal lands, in the playoffs of the major, in the finals of the major. You have to give it up when someone just does it every time. But put it this way, once we go past names like coldzera, I'll immediately go with like Shocks, fucking Nico. These players, in my opinion, are much better individual players than Fallen was. I think what Fallen was a very impactful player when you have the unit to win. If you didn't have that, like I say, do the analogy, make him go on to mouse spots like Nico, and all he's doing is AWP all the time on mouse spots. How great is his team, and how great is mouse spots? I don't think they'd even be relevant, mate. It's not even hitting on him.
I mean, it was a weird time though, right? Like that year, because it was like the fall off of like the French gods, I guess, right? And then and we still had a little bit residual from VP, but they were already at that time, right? They were already at that time as like, which VP are we going to get?
Yeah, right. A lot of teams falling, yeah.
And like TSM was still trying to. They still had like Carrigan. Was that the year they had Carrigan and Cajun B?
Yeah, I think
they got Kirby in the spring, but yeah.
Yeah, and like so you think about like you're just trying to work out who the other like elite teams were. Fnatic obviously had a pretty good portion of that year as well, right?
G2 2016 was that crazy G2 run with Shocks and Scream as well.
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard for me to like sit here and like remember, like, because I had that black period after I retired where everything kind of the lights went off, which was I think like June or something that year, right? But it's hard for me to like even think who else would be up for contention of that. And when you win both the majors for the year, right? I guess that I don't know. I'm just trying to. I'm not looking at the whole database here.
Is individual performances, and this is probably why I'm biased, because like Duncan says, it's not necessarily so much the numbers. It's for me the things I always remember are like the big plays and like big games and in vital rounds.
So many signature moments, yeah. Of course.
Yeah, like Columbus, obviously. I've got the rating in front of me. It was a 1.14 rating. It's not like Duncan says, not blockbuster numbers.
That ain't going to win you an MVP, but that way.
No, sure. But then they went to that DreamHack Austin, which they won afterwards. He played 1.48 there. That's like obviously that was his best performance for the year.
But generally, competition, but okay.
Yeah, exactly. But generally he was relatively consistent around the 1.14 to 1.18 range, round about that over
basically,
the course
to me, that's a sidekick. There's nothing wrong with it. Like, for example, one thing I think's amazing about what FaZe Clan does now is beyond miracle tournaments like Rain at fucking the major. They just do it all with, like, to me, they don't have a true superstar. Like, I don't think they even rely on ROPS like in the way that you could if you were a worse team. I think they just use like a committee of players. So my problem is this: he had coldzera next to him, mate. That's like essentially he's Scottie Pippen, and you're all telling me he's the second best player ever. Like, Michael Jordan, mate. He had Michael Jordan. Like, you know what I mean? I'm sorry. I'd love to get into the Scottie Pippen part, but we have to focus on that part first. You had Michael Jordan,
Yeah.
Because, by the way, it's the same story. Scottie Pippen analogy is even a good one. Scottie Pippen, by the way, can be an underrated player if you don't know some of the things he had in his game. But he obviously never wins 6 championships if he doesn't play with Michael Jordan. That's the kind of point I'm making here.
Yeah,
if you know the way those top 10, top 20 things work, that's why Chad's point about teams falling is a relevant one. The problem with the guys I'm naming, Sharks, fucking Nico, they're not on teams where they even have a chance to be put next to Fallen for one of those lists. You can't get deep enough in a major to be able to beat Fallen's winning the major. My problem is that, though. Nobody wins the major if they're not the best player, in my opinion. Like, at that point, we're just in the nonsense world where it's like essentially, can he talk? Could Fallen go to Simple like, hey, you're not a very good opera. I've won 2, mate. No, we all know Simple was a better player, wasn't he? It's irrelevant. It's a different argument you're having.
And if you look at Coldzera's numbers as well that year,
He's a mental, mate.
Yeah, 1.26 at Columbus, 1.35 at that DreamHack Austin. That was the only tournament Fallen actually statistically outperformed him. But 1.25 at the E League at Cologne, 1.31. I think it was an MVP performance for that was with obviously SK Gaming that they won. So I mean he was insane. While we're on Coldzera, then I'll ask you guys because I know he's fallen off. I mean they all have really compared to where they were.
Oh, it's been years.
Yeah,
which is 2016. We're talking about 6 years ago. It's a long, long time ago.
But in terms of all of the players that would be up there for discussion around GOAT status in the game. Would Coldzera still get into the discussion now in 2022? No,
not at all. No, I think he's gonna go down as the best player of that year, obviously, and of maybe that little two section.
First ever player to do back-to-back best player in the world.
I'm not putting him in GOAT status. I'm not putting. He hasn't
majors.
He hasn't had contention over a long period of time. I mean, even if you want, how big is this list of GOAT contenders do you want? Because I mean, if you want to put 7, 8, 10 players in that conversation, then yeah, we probably have Coldzera in there and include him in the topic. But if you want to do 3 of them, Simple's been dominating for what, 5 years now, essentially. Nico's been up there with Mouse Sports, hard carrying them 5 years ago, and he's still been one of the best players. Device as well is going to have to be in that conversation. So I mean, it all depends on how many people you want to put into it. But just right out of the gate, if we want to limit it to 3, I don't think you can even touch him.
I think the problem for me is that it's like Moses says, unfortunately now we've had this crop of people who all just have the longevity. I mean, the number of years they've done it in a row is just too impressive. So it's the thing, if we're talking about single years, I think his peak year would be very, very high. I think the 2017 year was fucking unreal as well. But yeah, the problem is his is more peak plus resume. I actually think longevity, for example, someone like Nico's won far less massive tournaments, but has had much better longevity as an elite player, like Moses says. So
also, I think too, you have to have the conversation also around if you want to talk about GOAT status as well. Simple essentially, had his dominant years, went to Navi, and he's essentially rebuilt that team around him. He's taken over as the leader as the face of that team and built it into a contender. Coldzera is not able to do that, and I think if you're going to be GOAT, I mean, again, you get into a sticky area where I want to talk about intangibles, but if you're a star player like Coldzera and you can't go off and rebuild a championship contender, then you're obviously missing a ton of pieces on how to be that kind of greatest of all time player, to be able to kind of get players around you that want to play how you want to play, that want to support you, that want to be involved in your project and actually make it work. And I mean, to be a player as good as him and not be able to have a second crack at it away from Fallen, away from Fur, away from FNX and Taco, that, I think that's pretty damning in his legacy of a player overall in his career.
Didn't age well, right? I think the fact that he got to go to phase with Nico and they could attempt to put their powers together and come up with something really strong and show exactly what you're saying right there. It's not that he didn't have that opportunity, right? And the thing that you'd hear about Coldzera back in the peak days was just his work ethic and his work. But when you look at him in the phase days, it didn't feel like it was the same him, right? Everything changed. The big lights came on. He'd had all the success. He'd been the best player. And then it's obviously dipped down to where it is today. And we're yet to see him have that resurgence. But it is kind of crazy, to think that somebody like Fur, he fizzled out, right? In a big way. He just kept the aggressive stuff up for years. It didn't work. The team fell apart. They tried to rebuild multiple different variations. And then now with this new roster, which when you're comparing it to the team that we're talking about, right? They actually have similar supportive elements. They have a lot of supportive players, and Fur gets to run around and do it, and he's playing well again. So I'm curious if making a system around Coldzera that's similar, where I don't know, the game's changed a lot. I don't know. I just don't think.
I don't think you can be as patient as Coldzera used to be in today's game.
You need a bit more pep in the step. You need to be a bit more reactive and take a bit more territory and stuff. So you'd have to reinvent the way he plays. But yeah, in terms of the GOAT conversation, it didn't age well.
I'll give you
another factor too. Yep. Sorry.
I'll give you an angle though that I do think is like legit as fuck for both this team and Cold Zero, which is when they were at their peak though, and in their prime, in the years when Cold Zero was really good. Like he has to be one of the best big game players ever in Counter-Strike. Like I said, like even as in he would even do the things that like I actually consider only people like Simple can do now, where it's like you come in as the number one player with the fanfare that you're the number one on the number one team with the expectation that not only will you win, you will be number one in this game. Like there are only a few players in any, even in sports, can do that. Like that's why if you are some fucker like Ronaldo and you just score every big fucking European Cup final, like, yeah, you're gonna get GOAT status. That's how you get it, because you're gonna imprint yourself in people's minds. Like I actually think it's why Cold Zero himself even sort of skated. Actually, when you talk about this phase period, he had a couple of years where he was pretty ropey individually, but he was just in everyone's mind, including all the competitors and people he's playing against. It's just like burned into your brain. Like Cold Zero is the best player in the world. He will find a way to become the best again. His game will always be consistent. Like I think he was a mega player for those years. So yeah, if like put it this way, if you here's an interesting list, he would be very high on. If you had one of those ones where it's like the aliens come to the Earth and you have to pick the player to win the game for you, if you could take Prime Cold Zero, you took a pretty fucking good player there, mate. He'll probably deliver.
What a scenario to build up. What a context. Aliens are invading Earth. Pick your Counter-Strike player.
So
I think.
Go on. I was just going to ask you, Jason. Like, I wanna steer the so make your point. I want to steer the conversation towards Columbus.
Yeah, okay. Well, I was going to say, just real quick, I think one of the big things for the context of this show in terms of this matchup against the old LDLC lineup is, for me, this team is super interesting and super weird to talk about, because when we talk about all the different eras that teams have formed that we've kind of attributed to teams over the years, the NIP era, the Fnatic era, the Astralis era, this one, we have Luminosity with an era, but this one is like the most confusing. I feel like this one actually ruins like most of like the criteria we'd have to building an era, because they only really won the 2 majors and the Pro League Season 3 finals. Like those are the S tier events they won. They won a DreamHack Austin. They got beat on all the other ones. And as all this talk about these guys being good big game players, which is all true, they lost. They got second place a lot this year.
And a lot of season finals.
Yep. And for a team that we've kind of attributed to an era, I think like it's really weird, because on one hand, I think it's a testament to how good they were, because they passed the eye test for like the entire year. Like they had some of the best players in the world, as we saw in the top 20, as we've talked about. Visually in the game, they looked good, like smart tactics, playing the game well, and just too many second places. So you can look at it from the other side and just say, man, if you really want to attribute, an era, we have the 87-0 NIP. We have the Fnatic team that won like 8 or 9 straight events towards the end, including 2 or 3 majors straight. We have the Astralis team that obviously was dominant for like a year and a half, winning everything. Like this is the one team where like they don't actually have a resume that should attribute them an era. Yeah, but they passed the eye test in that sense.
Basically, I actually did a video along these lines when I was trying to figure out if Team Liquid had an era or not. And I actually came to the conclusion along these lines that actually, I think you should be pretty strict with the eras and you shouldn't give them out frivolously. So I actually came to the conclusion we should take away the SK1. I think we all just were 2 prisoners of the moment that they won the back-to-back majors. Because as you say, they didn't win that many tournaments. In fact, the low-key angle, which is, it's kind of ironic when you consider they don't think it was a big deal. Actually, that SK move, which meant that they couldn't play in the playoffs of that first E-League, that might actually really have cost them their era, by the way. If they won that E-League tournament as well, which was like the week after fucking Cologne, that would have been a mega little run of tournaments. Like you could have established it a bit more. Like I actually think that did end up costing them, because like if you look realistically, like put it this way, even some of the teams that don't have eras have better wins. They just don't have the 2 majors.
Sure. Well, let's talk about one of the majors, because this is sort of the ascent to the top. This is when, I'm thinking back, I don't remember anyone really talking about the Brazilians winning in Columbus.
I don't remember anyone picking them to win.
Yeah.
I don't remember either, but they would have been probably pegged at as a dark horse, as like a really underrated run, just because the week before was Katowice.
Terrible thing to do with dark horses, really, but
but God bless Richard. Yeah, they had that Fnatic, the Fnatic final as well, where they went all the way to the final to play off against Fnatic in Katowice, and they 13-2'd them the first half on overpass, and then Fnatic came all the way back and beat them in overtime. And then I think like the second map was a smashing for Fnatic, and the third map was like another 12-3 first half where Fnatic came all the way back. So I think between that and towards the end of 2015, when they made the roster changes and they had that crazy run to the finals and that Face It event, I think people would have probably had their eyes on him, but not picked him to win in any way.
The big tournament prior to this was the Intel Extreme Masters 10. their world championships, and they did get runner-up status there, but they got battered by Fnatic in the best of 5 final. And if you go and look at the tournament structure there, by topping your group, you were dropped straight into the semi-finals. All the groups were like, best of ones. So, it didn't really necessarily feel legit. They only had to beat, Na'Vi at the time, and they were in the final, essentially. That was the only, they only played one best of 3 and one best of 5. So,
some banging cheese sandwiches at that Katowice, I heard, though.
Yeah, maybe.
That was Cologne.
Yeah,
I mixed up my ESL events. My bad.
Yeah, didn't even get the cheese sandwiches, right? But anyway, so look, I went where, obviously we worked Columbus. I was there as I wasn't even hosting that one, so I was a little bit more free, kind of come and go and watch some of the games and stuff. And it was, in terms of that event, it was one of those where it was crazy because the teams people were talking about, if you remember, the favorites were Na'Vi. It was meant to be Guardians major, essentially. This is the one he gets.
The second of Guardians majors.
Yes, the second one that he got. But obviously as well, there was some rumblings about, Fnatic have still sort of been lingering. You can never rule them out. This was obviously when the TSM team that played as question mark for a little bit were Astralis now, and they still had Carrigan and Cage, and it was kind of like their last hurrah. People were wondering if they were going to be able to get over the hump. The real dark horse pick, because it was in Columbus in North America, everyone was talking about Team Liquid. I remember you being a little cheerleader for them at the time, Jason. Not so much these days, I've noticed. Weird that. But
sometimes you gotta.
I know.
Sometimes you gotta go. Sometimes you gotta go with the crowd.
It's the only appropriate time ever, Moses. Someone could ask that question: "Who hurt you?" And you could actually finish your answer.
I finally got a name. But
it was so that was, and obviously Virtus Pro were in there as well. It was it was a pretty stacked.
It's a pretty banging playoffs, yeah.
Yeah, and honestly, I think it's one of the best majors, of all time. It's right up there for me. But the way Luminosity won was insane. I mean, first of all, they top out their group. They beat Mouse. That was that super annoying Mouse bots. The ones that just never went away. If you remember, this was the major that had the flip side Mouse sports game that never ended. Made everyone sick to the
his
stomach.
water torture of CSGO.
Yeah, it was unfucking believable, wasn't it? And then you had they beat NIP, so they top out their group, and then they had to beat Virtus Pro, best of 3, Team Liquid, that epic game with the jumping AWP and just crazy, and obviously then they beat Na'Vi in the finals, which we all expected Na'Vi to be there. We all predicted Na'Vi on the desk. What we didn't know at the time was obviously Guardian was sort of recovering from a broken elbow. That was the injury that he'd sustained while playing football. He fell over, put his elbow down, and chipped the bone in his elbow. So he was playing on double sensitivity the whole tournament. Made it to the finals of a major doing that, by the way. And we didn't know up in the desk. No one had said. So we only kind of found out during the final that was going on. So, it looks
very... Clue me in on that before I made a prediction. You can. Cheers. You're on your own tournament, man as well. You fucking rat. I'm glad you didn't win a major. Yeah, Cloud9, you're tilted Guardian. Nah, I can't even in jest pretend Cloud9 when it was good.
No, but so I have to ask, with all the additional caveats and little bits of information, all the stuff that was going on, talk me through your memories around this major, whether and how legitimate a major win you think this one is for this team, because this is their rise to the top.
For me personally, I mean, let's see. Well, I would challenge you on the idea that people were kind of talking about Liquid as a potential team to win that event, just because I remember specifically that was the era of online broadcast work where every fucking asshole who wanted to make a name for themselves on a desk or in a castle was there to shit on NA. It was easy interaction. That was the easy joke to fall into. So I remember actually being at that event and making a concerted decision to speak positively about NA teams because everyone was just dumping on them for funny little laughters on Twitter. But
the birth of the bald eagle.
Yeah, exactly. That's where it came to be. I think also remember too, like NIP was a team that people thought might play pretty well there, but they had the visa issues with Pitt, couldn't make it, and I think what PETA had to stand in, or no, Threat stood in for them at that event as well. So I mean, there was some stuff there. Yeah, I basically I just I don't actually remember who might be some of the other dark horses, but I don't take this away from them. I think there was also the sketchy thing with Fnatic too, where Olaf was recovering from like wrist surgery or had a wrist injury as well at the time. So that was like kind of a really weird layer of that event coming into it. But I don't know. I personally don't take any wins at a major away from a team, because it's all super hard when you have this many teams that are focusing directly on one event, even with some of those, I guess, caveats of the injuries. But for them to do it in the fashion they did, with the comeback against Liquid, two of the back-to-back comebacks on those maps against Liquid being down so much is absolutely incredible. And I think, anytime you're going to be able to take down VP in a series as well on a playoff stage is a huge accomplishment. Also, those guys were hard to put away. So I thought this was a very, very good run for them. And I thought it was like I think I was happy they got it at the time, because it felt like it was very much like a strike while the iron's hot moment for this team. Like after the collapse in Katowice in the grand final against Fnatic, after losing the grand final previously, I think to Fnatic as well in that Face It event at the end of 2015 with the brand new roster, I think they just like caught some incredible like momentum at a team that just came together like naturally right at that point. And I don't know what would have happened if they didn't like win this, if they didn't get that kind of capstone. So I always thought this was actually a pretty important map or series or event for those guys to win overall.
I don't know. I look at this here and I'm just trying to remember like the Counter-Strike and where I was at. Like this Columbus one, I remember we lost the qualifier. We ended up beating Dignitas in the opening game, and then we lost to Gambit, and then we lost to Cloud9 in the best of three. And like Cloud9, we play them a lot because we were like in North America, right? And then so the event, I guess, just looking at it from a Luminosity standpoint, it was kind of a big deal because they represented more than just Brazil. I guess they were like kind of representing North American Counter-Strike at the time as well, because they were living there. And the region that's when we had TSM and COG and Winter Fox and Renegades were there, and everybody was playing, right? And it kind of felt like, oh shit, like these guys can do it. And even though I know I just said they're like 16-0 us before, but when you're playing against them and you're practicing against them, it kind of makes that goal not feel that far away. So for them to be the best team in the world, to win both back-to-back majors, right? That was pretty fucking huge. And I think in the conversation point that I brought up before about the bomb timer changing, I think the more we like look at that, you can see the shift of the players who were good pre that with the more scrimmy fast, and then this kind of like handover to where modern Counter-Strike is at today. And the more I think about that, like I think that's really important, because they were versing some of like the best players of the history of early CSGO, right? Like we're talking the VPs, the good French rosters, the good Swedish rosters, and this is where it was kind of like a transition of which ones are going to be able to hang with the way that the game's been playing. With only small adjustments at time, but the game has clearly changed. So I think that was key, and just to be able to keep their cool in big events. You look at that Liquid series, sure, Cold Zero does that round, right? The jumping AWP, but they still had to win. They were down, 15-9 in that one. And I think on the next map, which also went OT, they were down like 15-6 or some shit. And then the first game against Na'Vi, they lost the first half of a grand final, which is a big deal for like all of those guys, right? For that level of a grand final. I think they were down 11-4 the first half on Mirage as well there. So like it was like good to show how that they can be like big stage players, and that they can hold on to those games and not just crumble and get fucking wrecked. So yeah, it was entertaining Counter-Strike.
And from a big picture perspective too, if you want to bring in like the NA scene to it as well, like I don't think a lot of people realize there was like a shift in Luminosity at one point where they were playing a little bit more. I mean, it might have, I can't remember the exact time, it might have coincided with the game changes, but where they shifted from like having a little bit more of like an aggressive scrimmy pug style. And I remember they came back to NA after an event, and like playing against them a couple times. They went from like that fast-paced puggy style and switched into trying to make like the slower, more strategic, more tactical aspect actually start to work. And they actually, at least within the NA scene, they actually hit like a pretty big dip. Like while they were one of the few teams coming out of the region that was able to continually make playoffs at the major, within NA, when they got back to regional competition, they were like getting beat at like the Pro League lands or the Pro League tournaments, the online leagues that were going on at the time, because they were making this shift and trying to like change philosophically the way they wanted to play. So it was cool seeing that kind of rewarded, because that's a very like long-term play. Like you have to like invest like 2 to 3 months into like getting that style down before it's really going to kind of catch on and click the way you want it to. So it was cool to see that rewarded. And just from a bigger sense of the NA scene, for a team to finally show when they won this event that you could come out of the North American scene and win a major was super important just to the mentality of the whole region, because it was very much the same way it is now, where all the top players at the top and all the pros are like, yep, it's pointless. There's no reason to be in NA. You can't possibly make progress in NA. And then like Luminosity just came out of nowhere, be like, bitch, we were playing the game on hard mode down in Brazil. We'll show you how it's done, and to like rise up through the whole scene and become major champions. I think that was very inspiring for the North American region. And I think it was super important to be able to show the other teams and players that it could be done if you work hard.
Yeah,
Didn't catch on, but you know,
What a great life lesson.
Yeah, indeed. Oh well, look, we'll move on to their opponents. There is another team in this equation. Obviously, we can talk about Luminosity all day, but they are taking on the 2015 EnVyUs. And which lineup is that? Well, obviously, this is when they made the roster move to bring together, some of the gatekeepers of the French scene. With some of the raw talent. Obviously, Shocks and Smiths went out from the old EnVyUs lineup, and in came Kenny S and Apex, obviously, firm friends who know each other, and that was Happy as the IGL, NBK was there, and Kiyashima made up the five. Now, this team's a little bit different to a lot of the other ones on the list, as I'm sure you're aware, because it had a relatively short shelf life. They came in, it was explosive. I remember at the time when we were doing By the Numbers, I said to Duncan when this move was announced on the episode, and it's so long ago, this was like back in the old Alpha Draft days. So the original series of By the Numbers, I said that team will win the next major, and it was going to be Cluj-Napoca was the one that came up. And I think a lot of people still felt Na'Vi were going to have their time. And
the first of Guardians majors.
Yes, the first of Guardians supposed majors. And obviously, what was bore out with that one. But afterwards, there really isn't necessarily a lot to crow about. I mean, they were a very, much like their play style, they sort of exploded onto the scene. They were like beating people, winning high-profile tournaments, kind of get their major, and then, fuck off. Like, it's kind of surreal.
If I remember correctly, I know they were at the time, but I'm assuming they still remain the only team to win the major and then place last at the very next major that came along.
Yes.
They got eliminated last place at Columbus.
Yep. That's right. And remember, when they were on the come up as well, I think they were with this same lineup. They obviously had they competed at Cologne and they lost to Fnatic, who was a little bit of a nemesis for them originally. When they had this lineup, they never seemed to be able to get the better of them until they kind of like leveled up and got their major under their belt.
It's the thing though, that's what makes this lineup crazy though, because as you just pointed out at the end there, they actually could have won 2 majors. They could have gone back to back. If people forget that major final, that was the first map, was that Dust 2 game where they were up massively. It was like 15-8 or something mental. Then Crims won that like miracle round from the closet car area, and then everyone remembers it ends with that mad thing on the last round where like Apex peeks out in a 4 ops looking down to, and like this is the moment he fucked up. Like everyone remembers that classic moment. Well, the thing is, that was their map. If they win that map, yes, the next map's Cobblestone, which obviously they're fucking Fnatic was always amazing on. But if you go 3 maps there, like that was actually the end of Fnatic's time. That was when they were sort of like nicking trophies on the way out the door. So there's even a world where this just shows how crazy accomplishment is in Counter-Strike, because of all the teams on this list, I don't think this is that great a team, like eye test wise. Like I'm not picking this team to stop aliens blowing up the world, blah blah blah. But I tell you what, they actually low key could have had 2 majors. Like this team actually got like quite a few trophies in the door.
It's interesting, right? Because you talk about the ODLC roster, we already did those boys, right? And then you look at this team, and then when you compare the rosters, because the thing is, Shocks and Smith went to Titan, right? They did the swap, having Apex and Kenny come in. Titan was left with Existence, Maniac, RPK, Shocks, and Smiths. Where's the firepower there, right? Like RPK was, but that's the thing. It was Shocks, right? And it was meant to be like Existence being able to call their way out of these holes. And on the other side, it was just all the firepower, because the way that Happy would approach the game, they would just have the executes that Existence would come up with, right? Because they all played with Existence at one point. So they just brought the executes across to this team and had upgraded firepower. So everything we said about the EnVyUs roster before, even when Shocks and Smiths were there, we were saying like Smiths was a good, like playing the role AWPer, right? But Kenny was like that fucking run-in crazy AWPer, go absolutely nuts. They still had Happy there doing exactly what Happy like they were still good force by team. They were still good on Tech 9s. They still had that lurky, annoying playstyle. And then they brought in they had the polar opposite. They brought in a rabid dog of Apex who'd just charge up anywhere on his own, knowing that Kenny's orb's behind him, holding an angle, and Apex is just in their face. So like they went and took like two players and upgraded them with two really good can openers and still had the same base of the team. So, like, for me, from everything we said about LDLC, having the good Tech 9 executes on maps like Cation Inferno, they still had all that, but they just upgraded even more firepower. And it was like, it was a really strong team.
I would be remiss if I didn't bring this up, though, Richard, which is because it's just so surreal. This also contains, though, funnily enough, about the topic of roles and who does what in a team and firepower. This brings up what I think is one of the most surreal stories of all time, which is a player who won the major, then wasted his time having an argument about what the team is about. This is Kiyashima, if people remember the story from By the Numbers. He just sat down with me and Richard in a bad mood. I don't know why. He just won the world championship, right? And instead of just thinking like, well, who cares what they think? I proved them all wrong. He just did like the sort of like Twitter reply guy of like, he's just going to argue with us about it. And what he was arguing with us about, Chad, was that we just implied Shox is a better player than him. We hadn't even technically even said, you know, Shox should be in his place or like he shouldn't be in the team. But just that fact sort of triggered him so much. And so basically, the reason I bring it up is it's mad surreal that someone who wins the major is wasting their fucking time sort of slumming it with us like that. Like, just go have your champagne, mate. You've won on this day. And then the other thing is, like, I actually do think that belies, though, why this team was so short lasting, though, as a top teammate. Because the actual vibe I got was this. They were winning still, so people were still buying into sort of Happy's vision, as it were. But even then, like, people felt like it was bullshit. He got all the credit. He gets all the MVPs. Like, you know, I think that team was always like fucking, it was always bubbling under the surface. And then people might know the story that when they were doing the boot camp for Cluj-Napoca, they lost so much that the real story, this is real, is they went, right, let's just not scrim anymore because it'll make our morale go down too much if we lose every scrim.
Absolutely
and
true.
They won the bloody major. So the joke is they would have just broken up if they didn't win that major.
I heard they won that while in the conversation, just blow up the team.
We need Maniac to do like a tell-all of French Counter-Strike, because I remember, like, do you remember like at ESWC events, like the event would be over or whatever, and then they'd all just be out the front, like in their different groups, which weren't their rosters, hanging out with bottles of wine in their hand, like just talking about the roster changes back in the day. And then
that was always brilliant. Week, as you're saying, if you're like an observer, though, you can just see like, oh, so they're going to be in a team next year. Oh, right, well, they're going to be in a team. That's it's not just based on who's having wine with who, basically.
It was legit that way, though, right? And they would always, the thing is, they were always so passionate about the way they'd be talking about shit, like there'd be tears and stuff. And I like,
bro, I used to love when they would do the actual Game of Thrones. They would go up to the one that they hate, kiss them on both cheeks. How are you, brother?
Like, it's crazy, right?
Like, are they doing this just for our benefit? This is mental. This is like I'm actually watching like fucking Days of Their Lives or something now. What is this?
Yeah, I always found that odd.
I loved it though. It's the shit.
It's like you guys just cut this motherfucker, and there's so much bad blood, and we all know it. Why?
Yeah. French Counter-Strike always delivered. I mean, we were like, obviously coming from Source, I was blessed with it as well because, you know, the last 4 years of our game were like sort of dominated by the French scene, a little bit of Belgian influence as well, obviously via the way of existence, and you know, but yeah, they were like French teams just never seemed to really last. Like, you know, they were always gonna, even when they were on top. There was always going to be something that was going to cause a rift. And I agree. I felt like this team was on borrowed time. I mean, if you look at the personality archetypes in this, it is a fucking time bomb team if ever there was one. You've got Happy, obviously, like, just a notorious sort of like, you know, anyone who's talked to Happy, I know you, Duncan, have a pretty good relationship with him. You know, like, anyone who's talked to him, he is, when it comes to his philosophy about the game, unbelievably arrogant. Like, just will not budge in terms of his philosophy, and I don't think he has a particularly sophisticated outlook, frankly. Then you've got MBK in there, obviously Kiyashima, we've just talked about. Kiyashima, by the way, this was like essentially his last flirtation with the top. I don't know what the fuck he did to piss everyone off in the French scene. Pretty hard to do, but you know, he's been on the outs ever since. NBK, obviously, is, you know, we've talked about him a lot. We'll go a bit more in detail in him, time permitting. Kenny S, another guy who's like, you know, bit temperamental, you know, and Apex, obviously, the face that launched 1,000 memes. Like, can you imagine these 5 players coming together to fucking achieve a common goal. Obviously, this was borrowed time, and like Duncan says, I remember those stories coming out that they had just stopped scrimming. They weren't scrimming anybody because it wasn't even just that if they were losing, you know, it was going to reduce morale. There was friction there too.
That sounds like something like a fucking like Who's on First type old school hackneyed skit though. Like, we're losing all the scrims. Shit, better just stop scrimming entirely then. Good plan. Like, what? And then even worse, you win the major. Like, because that's the part people don't think about. Now, knowing that detail now, Chad, now go back into the actual tournament that they won. Because remember that famous detail where they were 1 round from that bullshit Fox, Rain, Jacob G2 beating them to go to the major final. So if they lose that 1 round, dude, they probably just break up immediately. They don't win this major. The team's over. Who the fuck knows? Maybe Kenny S is back to titles. Who the bloody hell knows? It would have been a complete blow up. Like, if people don't know, they even actually kept that lineup way too long afterwards because it just was too successful. So I'm sure in the back of their head they were like, "We'll get it together again," but they never did. In fact, they were, as Moses said, by the next major, they were so bad they went out in last place. They were just flunking everything. Yeah. I don't think that's another thing. I don't think I've ever seen like a lineup not even change anything, just go from like best in the world to like not even relevant. Just like, even though as far as I can tell, it was one of those ones where like they didn't do anything fundamentally different. That style just didn't work anymore. They just fucking tanked the whole game, and then all the players' stats just fell down the drain. And like, oh, that was the way that team ended was so underwhelming. Because as we say, like in the beginning, they were winning everything.
Yeah. In terms of firepower on this roster, you know, like I'll come to you on this, Chad. This is obviously when, you know, they bring in Kenny S, who I wouldn't say he was necessarily at the peak of his powers, but, you know, pretty close to. He was 6th best player in the world according to HLTV in 2015. But obviously as well, this is when Apex was the entry monster, you know, a pure just raw entry fragger, and so you had to deal with, you know, probably the you know, you can have an argument as to who the fastest AWPer was around about this time period. You know, was it Guardian? You know, was it Kenny S? But obviously you've got to deal with that, and then you've got to deal with Apex as well. And you know, I feel like this was like a team that, like you say, they just brute force their way through a lot of games, right?
They were all producing, right? I think like we're talking about the firepower. You talk about Kenny.
Well, that
he
year
was
again,
rated,
four
so was Happy.
Players in the top 20 again. Yeah.
Yeah, but theirs wasn't. They obviously didn't have the same highs of like the Luminosity, for example. But they still had 2 players in the top 10, right, and then another 2 in the top 20. I think the thing is, like I said before, bringing in for Smiths and Shocks, right? Smiths was never an AWPer of the same ilk as Kenny, right? They would never go in the same conversation. Kenny's an absolute monster. Like he was just fucking scary. He was doing those things. That's why Anders, you know, yelling like a crazy person. Is like that's when Kenny was like, that's the magic stick. That's everything that everybody loves about Kenny. Was in this team where Counter-Strike was a lot more. I used the word crude before. I think the word crude is still very fitting here because you're not having the same people playing percentage every situation, jiggling every corner. Kenny would have these situations where he'd find himself in the thick of things in some poorly thrown smokes, but flicking around with the AWP, obliterating every jewel that came his way, right? He would get those opportunities back then and he would deliver. That's how quick he was. That's how flick he was. And then you still had Happy there, who like is I think I called him like Blame F before, like Blame F was around, right, with the solid rifling and stuff. But I don't know, it's just that base of the team. MBK Keo Happy, the way that they played with the 2 upgrades of Apex and Kenny coming in, what that brought to the team, I think, was a lot more. Just they had a lot more penetration power through 2 big weapons, right? A guy who would entry frag and always take that space. So Apex liked doing it, and Kenny would like to take fights with the AWP, and that gave the room to everybody else because we're not really talking a huge amount about MBK here or Keo here, but they would have their rounds, right? I think in against Fnatic, I was going back and just watching some tape on it. It's like the old Dust 2, and you can see, I think in the Dust 2 game they're playing in that grand final, Envy win 4 spies on both halves, like in the first 3 rounds, right? So like they were taking that title from the team who was known as like Fnatic with the Tech-9s, and Fnatic with the CZ, those teams who were good at winning. These guys were equally as good at winning those type of 4 spies, right? So they just had that's the thing. We spoke about this last time about Happy and like the way he approached the game. Again, it's just this more in your face, pacey, understanding rotations, good individual Counter-Strike, right? Like in terms of team-based, we didn't start really getting into that shit until the Astralis. Well, not obviously we had team-based Counter-Strike, but not to the same degree, right? Not to the same fine-tuned amount we have these days.
Yeah, this team, I don't know. They I wasn't a huge fan of the way this team played. I think their biggest part of the reason why they were so successful is also, I think, part of the reason why they were never going to really have longevity is as we've kind of alluded to. Like they didn't, it never really felt like they had like a great cohesive idea of how they wanted to play as a team. They just had players that were they were the pure players in these roles, like the last run of like the pure traditionalists in each role. Like Apex is the entry fragger. That's all he did was entry frag. Kenny S with the sniper, absolutely mental with that sniper. And then Happy, obviously, with his lurking and just incredibly pure lurker. And when you have someone like Apex being a crazy man on one side of the map and you have with the best sniper in the world on that side of the map finding you one kill, the lurk is going to get more efficient. But it never really felt like there was like a whole great plan to get all those different elements of the team to actually be working together to actually take the team to the next level. So I think that inability and that French stubbornness that we've seen persist throughout their time in Counter-Strike was always going to prevent that team from actually getting close together and being able to use all those different pieces effectively as like one team. But since they were so good individually, they had like this time in the sun where they did get second at Cologne, where they did go on to win the Cluj-Napoca major. But it was also kind of obvious, like, and even just hearing the rumors behind the scenes at the time, that it just wasn't going to be able to last super long. So I don't know. I was never a huge fan of how they played as a team, just great individuals in all the specific roles.
For me, the difference is if you contrast this with the other lineup they had before, the one where they had Shocks and Smiths, I think that was a better actual team. Like as a unit, I think it played together a lot better. I think it's even better personality and role fit. Like, for example, one thing I thought about the lineup we're talking about now that wasn't as good is for a team that, like I say, almost won 2 majors. I mean, almost won 0 majors as well. That's like how swingy they were. And one of the factors that doesn't surprise me as to why they were so hit and miss is their map pool was way smaller than a lot of the other great maps. Like they could play like Mirage, Inferno, Cash, like, but people will forget this. Like, for example, if you remember the major final they had at Cluj-Napoca where they played against Na'Vi, if people remember, here's the story. The first map was Train that Na'Vi picked because Na'Vi's really good on Train, but also that was a map that actually the Envy guys weren't that good on. And that was the one they won, like something meant like 16-14 or 16-13. They narrowly won it, which put them on Cobblestone, which they won the title on. Now, if they didn't win that first map, the decider would have been Dust 2. Now, in your brain, you're going to go, French team, Happy, Dust 2, easy. No, this team was actually ropey on Dust 2. They weren't that great. Like, they actually low-key would probably have been favoured to lose the major if they lose that first map. So that actually ended up being like a key win. It's where Happy had that grenade killing a 1v1, if people remember the inner on Train. Yep. So, like, to me, like, this team was one where it's like, when they hit, they got hit really hard. They had a lot of skill, like even beat like NBK. Fans would probably be surprised. Go look up how many kills per round, something like that's averaging in tournaments. Like, it's pretty sweet. He's averaging the kind of kills that like Falden's getting when we're talking about the years people are making this guy fucking second in the world. So I think the firepower was really good. The maps they were good on, but like this was a super hit and miss team to me. Like I don't think it's actually that great an all-time team. I think they have to be in here because of the accomplishments, the resume, some of the names. But I actually think in terms of all these teams on the list, I think it's one of the ones that's a bit inflated, you know?
Yeah, and just a few thoughts about MBK. I mean, obviously, every time we talk about a great French lineup, he seems to be involved. That's why, you know, his nickname sort of is the Kingmaker. At this period in his career, Duncan, where was NBK at?
Right, this is as in a player or as a figure, do you mean?
Well, both, I would say.
Okay, I would actually say, to me, as a player, this was the end of his prime, because this year and the year prior was the year where he became like more of the support player, if people remember. But he was actually so good. The discussion, in the same way as the discussion was like, who's the best AWPer, Kenny S Guardian or Skadoodle Guardian? The discussion was, who's the best support player, Xyp9x or MBK? That was a real discussion. It wasn't just like now the foregone conclusion, right? It's always Xyp9x. Xyp9x is the GOAT of the role, blah, blah, blah. Back then, it was a real debate. I even remember when they actually did beat Fnatic at one of these tournaments, might have been that Gfinity one. I'd remember one game on like, I think it was Cash, where he just styled at him and dropped like 30 on like fucking prime Fnatic. Like, this guy was a very skilled player. And he's also, key thing is, he's a guy who could have been a much more star role, and he's chosen to take on shittier roles. So just like Xyp9x, when someone does that, if they can succeed at it, then they're OP as fuck, aren't they? Because they're playing shit roles, but they're also more skilled and more experienced than they should be, and they just deliver extra. And then I would say this was, to me, the latter period of when he was the true Kingmaker. Like, this is when he still could actually pull all the strings. You can see he's not the guy getting kicked out of these squads. After this squad, he's not the one who gets booted. They all leave Happy behind. Like, at this point, he's still in control, but this is the end of his time because, like I say, I think as his prime as an individual player fell off, I think he was one of the players where, don't know if he himself knew this, but I think a lot of his status came from the fact that, like, the respect is how good he is in the game, and that when he was just then a figure where it's still got all the experience and all the great ideas, I don't think it sells as well if you're not as good, like by example, as it were.
I think one of the important things to kind of touch on too with this is, this was also a time in 2015 where I think Kenny S was still kind of just learning how to get over, like he was one of those players like heavily affected by the mentality, and he was always like playing a game against his opponents and his mentality. He had a horrible finals in that Cologne one, if you remember. Like he ended that event on stage in tears just because his performance just wasn't up to his standards and wasn't up to par, just to be frank about it. And I don't think it was really until he figured it out around Cluj-Napoca that they were having any success. So there was still some shakiness. I think another good event he had in 2015 was that IEM Gamescom that I just looked up, but that was the one where they were using that crazy format where it was like EO1s and you Chad knows.
What map you're playing at. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and we had OJ as the host, and it was done as like I think the community kind of like helped work out what map it was going to be, and then you could like form alliances and shit to work out who was going to play who. We played like SK a lot, which was like Katie and Barry and that mob. But that was a fun event. It's like a bit different.
That was the family show meme. That's where that was born.
Yeah, God B was there still playing.
He still, I think Kenny has still had some issues to work out with his mentality and staying solid through a lot of this lineup and figured it out towards the end, which kind of marked their big wins. But as we all know, like it's only with the French teams, it was only a matter of time.
Yeah. So look, I guess we can go to the voting as to who would win in this theoretical matchup. I'm guessing it's going to be unanimous, so I'll just cast mine in first. I do have Luminosity winning this one. Yeah,
me too.
I do too. I'm with Luminosity all the way.
They would win, and they even did play and did indeed beat them, so I would also take them to win.
We have indeed got real evidence. So yeah, not a particularly difficult one to call. We're all in agreement here. Luminosity go through to the next phase of the tournament. I've got it written down on paper.
Just as a humorous aside to wrap this point up, though, believe it or not, when this Luminosity team went to a tournament shortly after winning the major, obviously they won Cluj-Napoca, didn't they? They went to the aforementioned Face It Stage 3, the first event of Luminosity against this EnVyUs squad, and actually they eliminated EnVyUs in last place, right? This is where I knew for real that we were just fucked for Brazilian fans, because this was the first event where the Brazilians were really good in CSGO. And spoiler, from that match onwards, as in, you understand this, fans, by predicting the world champions to beat a team that started the tournament 0-16, already there were death threats. So I knew if there's death threats on that prediction, like this train never stops. Like we're going over the edge of the cliff with it, and like I'm just going to the fucking dinner cart basically.
This was still when we had CSGO Lounge as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah, back then it was rough out there, man. Yeah, it was rough out there back in the day.
Times were hard indeed. But yeah, so Luminosity go through where they will take on the 2019 Team Liquid.